When contemplating Album of the Decade, we first had to look at those albums that scored the #1 overall ranking for each year and choose among those which was the best. Is that truly the Album of the Decade? I would say that the choice is probably the one that I would have. But there are so many other albums that were released throughout the 2010s that deserve to be spoken about. 25 of them we're actually going to discuss on this list. Does that necessarily mean that this starts with number 12 and then ends with number 37? Not really. This is not a combined list with those number ones that we discussed in the video prior. Instead, we're going to look at this almost separately. And the one that hits number 1 you could consider as the best album to not achieve a number 1 ranking in the 2010s. So I know that that's a little bit confusing. I apologize for that. Perhaps sometime in the future on social media I'll post an actual list combining these two. But for now, let's take a look at the top 25 albums that did not achieve a number 1 ranking in the 2010s. And we start with number 25, which is Ahab and the Boats of the Glen Cadarig. Now, this one was a little lower on the list for its year, but it's one that, with subsequent listens, I've grown to absolutely adore. I bought the book that is associated with it, and it is now somewhat of a tradition to read the book alongside listening to the album. This is funeral doom at its finest. It's definitely, in my opinion at least, Ahab's finest hour, and a glorious album. I am looking forward to whatever follow-up that they are able to give us in the 2020s. Number 24 is an Abstract Illusion with Illuminate the Path. This feels so low. It feels so low. But an Abstract Illusion was a fantastic find just a couple of years ago. This is a band that easily could fit within the same realm as a Neoblithiscaris, and does so with such grace and such youth, but also with such maturity. They are wise beyond their years, and this album is absolutely essential listening. Number 23 is Caledon Brood with Echoes of Battle. Speaking of the Boats of the Glen Cadarig, Caledon Brood is a villain from the Malazan Book of the Fallen book series, so once again, listening to Echoes of Battle while reading one of those books is fitting. Not to mention, this is also terrific atmospheric black metal. It's one of the absolute highlights of this decade, and one of those underground gems that perhaps you don't hear as much about as you probably should. We are just in desperate need for a second album. Please make it happen and continue all of this, please. Number 22 is Persephone with Spiritual Migration. One that didn't initially get a review, but just recently did as a retrospective follow-up. This album is absolutely glorious. This is taking all the best elements of progressive music as well as some of the other more extreme influences and throwing them together into a witch's brew to create a really underground, silent stalwart that was able to only build the legend of this band as the decade progressed. This is something that made Athma, which was their follow-up from a few years ago, a really difficult act to follow, or, Spiritual Migration was a tough act to follow. Athma had that unfortunate duty. And Persephone now has given themselves all the reason to brag that they are one of the bands that have finally arrived. Number 21 is Rivers of Nile with Where Owls Know My Name. Talk about a band that had arrived. A band that definitely made a couple of changes in order to really boost themselves and create more passionate music. This was a more straight up death metal project before they added some progressive elements to it, added some random instruments such as a saxophone, which gave their music another edge. It gave them something that made them feel a little bit more unique, although maybe not totally the one in a million, but this is still an amazing album that showed the full-scale maturity that this band undertook throughout the 2010s and really since the beginning of their career. It now leaves a lot of folks really hoping that the follow-up is somehow able to supersede this album, but that will not be an easy thing to do. Number 20 is Thank You Scientist with Terraformer, 2019's number 3 album, and at one point the frontrunner for Album of the Year. This is a terrific display of progressive music and shows this group as one of the most diverse and most talented within that pool currently. And I love that this album does not necessarily stay confined within its own reality, instead making this a very seamless but also unpredictable listen. I enjoy what these gents are able to pull off. I love the fact that this album did not feel very derivative. It instead kept me very engaged. I wanted to listen to it over and over again whenever it was released. Such a critical listen right here at the end of the 2010s to show us what 2020 and beyond would have to offer. Number 19 is Ska Hamish with Triangle. And speaking about what the new decade has to offer, we have gotten a grand amount of black metal groups that have explored avant-garde, that have been more experimental, that have decided that the rulebook does not need to be conformed by. And Ska Hamish is a terrific example. Their newest album was very high up on the 2019 Album of the Year list, which is Hearts of No Light. But Triangle is a massive triple album. It shouldn't have worked, but it did. And wow, what an experience it ended up being. This is a terrific disc, one that certainly deserves its place, not to mention it demands repetitive listen. It is fantastic. Number 18 is Trees of Eternity with Hour of the Nightingale. More of a heartfelt pick, this one, considering we know that Alea tragically passed away from Trees of Eternity, but that does not necessarily mean that the album is a slouch and is just getting picks because of sentimentality. No, it is getting a pick because of just its beauty, its lusciousness. The tragedy that is behind it only amplifies the scope of its music, which was already incredible. This is a very underground pick. This is still one that doesn't have the same level of follow and support that perhaps it really deserves. And for those who listened to the brand new Swallow the Sun album in 2019, you should know that that was in tribute to Alea of Trees of Eternity. You should check this album out immediately if you have not as of yet. It is critical listening, and if you don't cry during one of these songs, you might not be human. Number 17 is the Faceless with Autotheism. Damn! This was really impressive. This was an album that really showcased the ability for technical death metal to also really expand itself, go with some longer ideas, and just really knock it out of the ballpark. I love that this album starts off with a 3-part cycle that just feels like, even if it were just done as one song and did not have the 3 divided tracks, it would be just as easy to listen to. They are clear-cut ideas that really stand well on their own, but whenever you have them individually like this, you realize that you have a conceptual piece that, man, if it would have been the entire album, my lord, it could have been massive and impressive and ridiculous, considering even without that being true, it was massive and ridiculous and impressive. What a great album. This is one that is easy to return to. You can get lost in this. You can listen to this in the car seamlessly with no issue. I love this album. It's terrific. My case has been beat to shit, by the way, for the number of times it's gone from in and out of my vehicle or just places, and oh my gosh, I need a new one. Number 16 is Caledon Decapitation with the Anthropocene Extinction. Now, some really love Death Atlas, thinks that it was able to top this album. I disagree, and that's really just a matter of subjective taste. But this really showed Caledon Decapitation at their finest. This is their finest hour, in my opinion. It is very accessible, but at the same time extremely raw, and this did not pull any punches. It took no prisoners. This is one that felt like it had the unbridled aggression of both grind and thrash at the same time, with death metal just really as the cherry on top. The whole combination, not to mention the strong songwriting, made this album feel legendary from the first moment it was heard. Terrific disc. Scope this one out if you have not already. Number 15 is Threshold with Legends of the Shires. This is a huge double album. What an undertaking by Threshold. They decided to go this way as opposed to their single album ideas that they're so familiar with. And that expansive nature was something that helped it massively, mostly because the strength of the songwriting gave it that edge. There is no song really on this album that feels weak, and that's whenever you consider both albums that are associated with it. That is not an easy thing to do. A lot of bands have plenty of difficulty trying to create a whole album, whether that's 8 or 10 songs that each feel individual and each feel really strong. This is done over the course of 2 discs. This is progressive music, which sometimes can feel a bit, predictable. This was not predictable. Threshold is on the top of their game with this album, and wow, what an experience it was. Number 14 is Darkthrone with the Underground Resistance. Now, longtime fans of this band probably saw this changeover coming, considering a lot of these influences were being explored in very small doses on other discs, such as The Cult is Alive, etc., etc., but they went full tilt boogie on this album, and my lord, this old school Elder kind of underground, extreme, raw, heavy metal influence is something that really took a lot of folks by surprise during the first part of the 2010s, and as a result, it was propelled to greatness. And this is also due in part to the fact that the songwriting and the influences that they choose to draw from were very strong and fit right within their own ideas and motifs. They didn't have to use or utilize black metal specifically in order to make these things work. They were able to do so within their own natural voice and using those influences as a guide, as opposed to just as a simple thing to try to quest for or to try to assert yourself toward becoming. They didn't aim to become those influences. They instead made themselves within those influences. It was absolutely terrific and is still great to this day. Number 13 is Dark Fortress with Elam. Man, this one has the real benefit of the fact that I have listened to this album to death for close to a decade, literally. This was one that whenever it came to the album of the year list, I think was in the high teens, so it seems kind of odd for it to be present on this list, but it was an ever-present part of my day, or, an ever-present part of my life, and has been so throughout the entirety of the decade. This is a terrific album, one that shows that Dark Fortress, shedding some of their previous notions, was a good idea. It helped them to make very lasting, very powerful black metal that felt like it had such a lengthy stay in coming. And then their follow-up was able to solidify that. They have another one coming out in 2020. They are taking their time with these albums, and my word, is that really working strongly to their benefit. I hope that this trend continues for this band. Number 12 is Trypticon with Melana Chesmata. This is just a beast. We wondered what was going to happen after Celtic Frost's monotheism, and we got that answer with the Trypticon project. And Melana Chesmata is one that may have been the real encompassation of everything that we were expecting and everything that we were hoping for. The darkness was just as real, the songwriting was just as crisp. Everything about this felt very evil, but also very realistic. It had that strength that was behind it that we previously talked about with an album such as Monotheist. It's a great experience overall. It has one of those potentials to potentially be a personal pick for one of my favorite albums. It would probably not make it to a top 50 like the one that we're about to do. But it'd be really, really close, right there on the fringe line. Man, it's just an amazing experience, and one that showed that this group was still able to create magic through darkness. Number 11 is Behemoth with The Satanist. This is the album of the decade for some publications, but not for me. This is one that really is strong, not to mention is Behemoth's finest hour, as the Rank 'Em All was able to showcase about a week ago. But this is an album that it just feels like a band finally culminating a long-term hunger for greatness. And they had had great albums prior to this. They had had magnificent albums prior to this, but The Satanists took them to a brand new level, almost as though they channeled the Dark Beast itself and was able to have, in exchange for their soul, the greatest album within their discography and within their career. This is one that's going to forever be the comparison point for any albums that subsequently follow, or in any retrospective review of albums that came before it. Number 10 is Iron Maiden with The Book of Souls. My God, this double album again should have and could have crashed and burned hard, but it did the absolute opposite of that. Instead, it came through and felt like one of the best albums that Iron Maiden, a band that has 4 decades in this business, it became one of the best albums that they've ever put out. And it's simply because it's a culmination of everything that had been happening for 15 years, ever since they returned with Brave New World. They were a band that was experimenting a little bit more with some progression. They were just writing songs that were within their style, but they were taking some leaps, they were taking some risks. Empire of the Clouds. Oh my God, that epic should not have worked. But it works amazingly because the pace, the tension, and everything that you get from this, it's incredible. It is able to get you right there in the scene. You can imagine it if you close your eyes, and you feel the heartbreak at the end. It is an exceptional disc. And this is one that is going to be, again, very difficult to follow up. They really don't even need to, but I hope that that Iron Maiden is able to deliver us 1 or 2 more albums that feel like they would be perfect companion pieces to what the Book of Souls was able to lay as groundwork. Number 9 is Overkill with Ironbound, starting off this decade with a thrash metal thrashterpiece. We talked about what Phantom Antichrist was able to do in the prior video, but this is an album that really started the decade off in a great direction, showing that thrash metal was not only still viable, but some of their old school stalwarts were still going to be able to craft impressive albums. And Overkill already had a great prior decade, so they were entering into the 2010s red hot with this disc. And this is one that ranks right up there among their elite, right there within their best, because it felt like, once again, another somewhat shedding of the skin, a somewhat of a reinvention. You know, after a couple of albums of sounding kind of similar, they had to come forward with something that had a lot of energy, a lot of effort, and a lot of destructiveness, and they did that. And not to mention, this tour was insane. It was great. Number 8 is Watain with Lawless Darkness. Just like Dark Fortress, Watain is a group that has had albums in the past that have been more raw, that perhaps have more praise within the underground community, but Lawless Darkness brought them to the surface and made them a name. This is an incredible disc that weaves black metal within the ideas of other forms of extreme metal, tosses in a little bit of experimentation here and there. Everything combines and culminates into what feels like it could be a once-in-a-lifetime album for these guys. And I hate saying that because I know that they're capable of giving us yet another album to this caliber. But again, this was another tour that was incredible and impeccable to see, considering it was a band that was at their top of the mountain. And they are going to continue to really showcase some of these different ideas, and did so throughout the 2010s. And hopefully what that will mean is that their first album in the 2020s will be a similar reinvention that will also hit just as hard. Sometimes you need that as an artist, and I think that Watain, despite the fact that this is still relatively fresh, even though it's been about 10 years, it's something that they could really use and combine perhaps some of those old school philosophies or things that you saw on their last album alongside of Lawless Darkness to craft perhaps the Paramount experience. Number 7 is Eson with After, and this was a hard one to pick. I knew it was going to be high, but it was between this and Arctis, and I didn't want to toss on 2 albums by the same artist on this list. I tried to avoid that, and I think I actually accomplished it. It's amazing. But Eson may be the most consistent artist of the 2010s, maybe the artist of the decade, or at least in the running for that, considering each one of the solo projects that he was able to unearth and give to us from this idea has been absolutely glorious. But After is the one that is long for my memory because it's one that I've played literally to death. And I don't mean I played it literally to death whenever it came out. I mean I played it literally to death last month. You know, it has had that sort of lasting power to the point that I may be willing to call it, you know, one of my most recent albums that feels like it could be one of my favorites of all time. We'll have to see whenever that list drops. But this is an incredible album. It's one that showed that Eson was not going to be a one-trick pony with albums such as Engel or The Adversary. It was instead going to be a constant thing that we were going to have. We were going to consistently look forward to each release from Eson and know that it was going to give us something a little bit different, but was also going to feel so tightly self-contained that it was going to feel glorious. And this album exactly was. Number 6 is Alice in Chains with The Devil Put Dinosaurs Here. Admittedly, if you asked me these questions about Best of the Decade a year ago, this album would probably not even be sniffing this list. But listening to this retrospectively over the course of the past 6 months quite a bit really showed me that I would have been very wrong. This is a strange era for Alice in Chains fans. There are still many that don't accept William Duvall, and a lot that don't see the albums that have been produced as comparable to the classics. And again, it's a very subjective opinion, but I think it's somewhat unfair. The Devil Put Dinosaurs Here is very comparable, in my opinion, to Dirt by Alice in Chains within the Lane Staley era. In fact, their career, you know, the twin career, I guess, of Alice in Chains has somewhat mirrored itself in weird ways. And why I feel that it compares to Dirt is its, you know, very honest delivery. The fact that this is very honest, it has some themology that is scattered throughout, and then the songwriting is just absolutely insanely good. You almost forget about that sometimes because you get hooked on maybe 1 or 2 tracks, or you remember hearing maybe Stone on the radio and you're thinking, you know, either that or one of the other tracks that was a single from this disc. And you forget about songs such as Phantom Limb that just prod and brood and is just one of the darkest songs that they've written. It's absolutely glorious. I have always been a big fan of Low Ceiling because that is a track that I dedicate to one of my uncles who passed away whenever this album was released. In fact, less than a month after this album was released. So it does have a lot of personal meaning to me. But this album is just overall just a wonderful showcase that William DuVall's Alice in Chains is just as good as Lane Staley's Alice in Chains. Is it possibly going to ever supersede it? I doubt it. I really do. I'm going to have to give that one to Lane traditionalists and agree. But I think that William was a great pick and a great selection, and it's only going to showcase itself more so as the albums continue to drop. Rainier Fog, terrific example of that. Number 5 is High on Fire with the Vermis Mysteris. This is one that, again, similar to like an Ahab or to a Dark Fortress, was not really high up on the list. It wasn't really sniffing Album of the Year. But this is the album from High on Fire that got me obsessed with them. I had listened and reviewed Snakes and the Divine prior, but this album made me a full-fledged believer in this band and made me love and eagerly anticipate each and every album that they delivered subsequently. And I love what this album does. It's a great combined effort of all of their different influences from the thrashier side to the more stoner side. It is all on display, and it has King of Days, which may be my favorite High on Fire song, period. A track that I've literally played 40 to 50 times. Just unfortunate the last FM doesn't show that because it was mostly during the time whenever I wasn't scrobbling. It'd be right up there probably within my top 10 tracks of all time. I'm just going to throw that out there. I play that song a lot. And this album is just strong on its own anyhow. You know, from front to back, it's just a glorious release, and it's one that I highly recommend. If you want to get into High on Fire, this is a great place to start. Number 4 is Insomnium with Winter's Gate. Good freaking gravy. Is this an incredible effort from these guys. It's a one-song album similar to Edge of Sanity's Crimson. I was trying to say Christmas because it's almost Christmas whenever I'm recording this, and because I have a cat named Christmas, but it's similar to Edge of Sanity's Crimson or Green Carnation's Light of Day, Day of Darkness, and within that tradition of those long songs being absolutely amazing and easily could be contenders, if not being albums of their respective year, this one was nearly album of its year. It's 40 minutes of absolute soul-crushing doom. It is amazing. It is well spaced out. It is well done. It is expertly crafted and just delicious to consume. If you haven't heard this yet, and you've maybe just heard Heart Like a Grave for the very first time, or that's your first exposure to Insomnium, do go back through this band's discography. It is a worthy travel, and Winter's Gate is a wonderful place to really show the band at their absolute best. Number 3 is Steven Wilson with Grace for Drowning. My lord, was this a hard pick between this one and The Raven That Refused to Sing. But I love Grace for Drowning simply for some of the songs that are encapsulated on it, the overall mood of this, and the fact that this showed that Steven Wilson was actually being somewhat restricted in Porcupine Tree. I know, it feels like heresy to say that, but the restriction was the fact that he had the freedom now to incorporate ideas from all walks of life and all varieties of music, and he did so with Grace for Drowning. He was able to showcase that prog can literally be just whatever you want it to be, and he had a great and tight album that felt, again, extremely self-contained, but also borderless at the same time. That sort of ambition and that sort of glory is something that comes along only maybe once in an artist's lifetime. And he actually, Steven Wilson, had 3 straight albums that felt like it encompassed those concepts completely, including one that was an album of the year. Number 2 is Astra with The Room. In retrospect, this may have been a better number 1 in 2018 than what we actually got. This is one that retrospectively I've listened to a lot more than the eventual winner. And it's because this is youthful progressive music that just showcases its ability to really use great pacing and terrific storytelling in order to do its job. I love what this album did. I think it's one that still is way too underrated for its own good. If you do not know this band and you like progressive music, you need to listen to it immediately, despite the fact that it's more than a year removed from its release. I look forward to whatever these guys do next. I hope that it is able to really size up to The Room, because they've really left themselves with a very difficult hole to climb, or mountain to climb, should I say. You can't climb a hole, you go down in a hole. Now we're back to Alice in Chains. Let's get to number 1, shall we? Number 1 is actually from 2019. It's amazing. This seems really odd, but it's The Liberation by Dissolution. And the reason why is quite simple. This was 0.1 away from being the album of the year. It was one of the closest, if not the closest, album of the years in many, many years, ever since we had a tie at album of the year. I just barely missed out. This is a huge album, principally because it is after a massive layover. It was about 13 years between albums for this group, and they came back and they were methodical. This album reminded everybody about what they had done with back in the times of Splendor, their first major release, and was able to take it one step further. I think this one may actually, in the long run, could end up being the bigger legend than that disc, and that disc already has a legend all by itself. This is extremely conceptual, kind of loosely though. It's all about struggle. It's all about, letting go. It feels almost fitting for this channel. It honestly does. It was odd that came out a month after I announced that I was going to be retiring, because it almost felt like confirmation that it was okay. Sometimes you hear stories that folks are afraid to pass away unless they are told by somebody that it's okay to let go. Dissolution essentially did that with an album. They essentially did that with an album, and they did so with masterful glory. This is progressive, this is experimental, this is extreme, this is beautiful. They did Tool better than Tool on one song, and I just don't know what else to say about this album. It's amazing. If you've heard me talk about it once already with the Album of the Year video, then you know just how majestic it is. And hopefully you've listened to it in that time frame between that video's release and this one, but if not, do it. Immediately after this video ends, go and listen to The Liberation by Dissolution. You will not regret it. And that's the list. Are there any that were left out? I know a big one that feels like it's omitted, and oh boy, thinking about that just makes me a little bit sad, but I'm going to toss a little 26th recommendation. Swallow the Sun, Songs of the North 1, 2, and 3. Another triple album. I thought about that after I was talking about Ska Hamish's Triangle. Swallow the Sun's Songs of the North 1, 2, and 3 absolutely deserves your listen and your attention, so check that out. I'm CoverKiller Nation. I hope that you've enjoyed these. I'll talk to you guys later. Take care.